Have you ever wondered why you can know rationally that you are good enough, lovable enough, or perfectly capable, and yet somewhere inside you, there's another voice telling you something very different. A voice that says, you're not good enough. You're going to get rejected. Don't get too close. Don't trust them. You need to try harder. Don't let anyone see how vulnerable you really are. Now that voice is what I call the inner critic. But your inner critic didn't simply appear one day. It developed for a reason. And to understand where it came from, we have to go back to something even more fundamental, your inner child. When we are children, we have emotional and developmental needs. We need safety, we need protection, we need affection and emotional connection. We need encouragement, we need recognition, we need acceptance, we need to feel that we belong. And perhaps most importantly, we need to have some sense that we matter to people around us. That doesn't mean parents have to get everything right. Nobody does. Children don't need perfect parents, but they do need enough emotional responsiveness, enough safety, and enough connection to gradually develop a reasonably secure sense of themselves. The difficulty comes when some of those needs are repeatedly not met. And there's an important distinction here. The unmet need and the feeling that comes from that unmet need are not the same thing. Imagine a child who needs emotional connection with a parent, but that parent is frequently unavailable. Perhaps they're physically absent, perhaps they're in the house but emotionally distant, perhaps they're preoccupied with work, depression, their own trauma, another child addiction, conflict in their relationship, or simply their own difficulty expressing emotion. The child's unmet need is connection. But what does the child feel? They might feel sad, lonely, frightened, rejected, unimportant, or simply have a vague feeling that something is missing. And this is where something very significant begins to happen. Because a young child doesn't have the psychological maturity to sit there and think, my mum loves me, but unfortunately she has unresolved trauma and therefore struggles with emotional availability. Children don't think like that. They experience what happens personally and in the moment. So the child begins to ask, often unconsciously, why are they there for me? And very easily the answer becomes, it must be something about me. Perhaps I'm not important. I don't matter. Perhaps I'm not lovable, that I don't belong. There must be something wrong with me. Those conclusions are not objective truths, they're childhood interpretations of painful experiences. But if the experience happens often enough, the conclusion becomes familiar. And when that conclusion is repeated often enough, it starts to become a self-limiting belief. This is where I think we can understand the developmental sequence very simply. There is an unmet need. That unmet need produces a feeling. The child makes sense of that feeling by developing a belief. And then the child develops a strategy for coping with that belief. So we have an unmet need, a primary feeling, negative belief, protective strategy. And somewhere within that process, the inner critic begins to develop. Let's take a child who doesn't feel noticed. Perhaps they discover that the only time they receive attention is when they achieve something. So they work harder, they perform, they become successful, they get good grades, they become helpful, they please people, and somewhere inside a rule develops. If I achieve enough, people will notice me. Or perhaps if I'm useful, people will want me around. That child may grow into an extraordinarily competent adult, but the adult may still feel strangely anxious whenever they stop achieving, because underneath all that competence is a much younger part saying, do I still matter if I'm not doing something? Another child, for example, may experience abandonment. Perhaps people repeatedly leave them. The child feels frightened and sad, and from those experiences, a belief develops. People I love disappear. Then comes the protective strategy of the inner critic. Don't become too attached, keep people at a distance, or alternatively, hold on to people tightly so they cannot leave. That creates one of the great paradoxes of adult relationships. The person who is frightened of abandonment may either become extremely dependent upon reassurance or become fiercely independent and avoid depending upon anybody at all. Both strategies can originate from exactly the same childhood wound of abandonment. And this is why I don't see the inner critic simply as an unpleasant voice that needs to be eliminated. I see it as a frightened protector. It learns rules designed to prevent you from experiencing the original pain again. The problem is that those rules may have been created by a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, or even a 12-year-old, and yet you may still be following them at 40, 50, 60 or 70 years of age. This brings us to another distinction that I think is really important. There are the primary feelings of the inner child, and there are secondary feelings that are created or intensified by the inner critic. Imagine your inner child feels sad because somebody important has become distant. The primary feeling might simply say, I miss you. I wanted you to be here. I wanted to feel important to you. I feel alone. That sadness is painful, but it is emotionally honest. Now listen to what the inner critic may add. They're leaving because you're not lovable. You always get rejected. Nobody stays. You should never have trusted them. You're going to end up alone. Suddenly, we don't just have sadness. We may have anxiety, shame, hopelessness, despair, and a much deeper sense that something terrible is happening. The inner child says, I miss you. The inner critic says, nobody will ever want you. The inner child says, I need comfort. The inner critic says, you're pathetic for needing anybody. The inner child says, I feel alone. The inner critic says, you will always be alone. Can you hear the difference? The inner child is describing an emotional experience. The inner critic is creating a story about what that experience means. And those stories can become extremely powerful. Because every time something happens in adulthood that resembles the original childhood wound, the old belief can become activated again. A partner doesn't reply to a message, a friend cancels something, somebody criticizes you, you don't get the promotion, someone appears emotionally distant, and suddenly the reaction seems much bigger than the event itself. You may even find yourself thinking, why am I reacting like this? Very often the answer is that two different periods of your life are happening simultaneously. The adult part of you is dealing with what is happening now, but the inner child is experiencing something that feels very familiar. And the inner critic immediately arrives with the old protection strategy. Withdraw, get angry, don't trust them, prove yourself, work harder, please them, leave before they leave you. And unfortunately, some of those protective strategies can actually recreate the very experience you were trying to avoid. If I believe nobody really wants me, I may constantly seek reassurance. Eventually the relationship feels pressured. The other person pulls away. And my inner critic says, there you are, I told you, people leave. Or I may avoid vulnerability completely. I never allow anybody close enough to really know me. And then I feel lonely. Again, the inner critic says, you see, you're on your own. The protective strategy ends up reinforcing the original belief, and the inner child gets wounded all over again. This is why therapy isn't simply about trying to silence negative thoughts. We have to understand where those thoughts came from. What were they protecting? What did that younger part of you need? What did they feel? And what conclusion did they make about themselves? Because that need wasn't met. Because once we begin separating those things, something important becomes possible. Instead of automatically believing the inner critic when it says, you're not good enough, you begin asking, what happened that made a younger version of me believe that? Instead of attacking yourself for feeling needy, frightened or sad, you might begin recognizing that there is an understandable emotional need underneath your reaction. And gradually, another part of you can begin developing, what I call the inner nurturing parent, the part capable of saying, I understand why this frightens you. I understand why you feel sad. You learnt a long time ago that people might not be there for you, but I'm here now. We don't have to abandon ourselves just because somebody else becomes unavailable. That is very different from positive thinking. We're not pretending that painful things don't happen. People do leave. Relationships do end. We do sometimes experience rejection. But healing means those experiences no longer automatically prove the childhood belief. Somebody leaving does not mean you are unlovable. Somebody failing to understanding you does not mean there's something wrong with you. Someone being emotionally unavailable does not mean you do not matter. And needing connection does not make you weak. Your inner critic developed because at some point it thought it was helping you survive emotionally. But you are no longer that child. And perhaps the work now is not to fight the inner critic, but to understand it, reassure it, and gradually allow the adult you have become to take over the job of keeping you safe. Because underneath the criticism, the perfectionism, the people-pleasing, the withdrawal, the anxiety, or the fear of abandonment, there is very often a younger part of you still asking a remarkably simple question. Am I safe? Do I matter? Am I lovable? Do I belong? And perhaps one of the most important relationships you will ever develop during this process is the relationship in which you learn how to answer those questions for yourself. So if you'd like help discovering your inner world, your inner emotional world, visit my website, email me, let's talk.